You're listening to Big World Network.
Skyfire, Season 2, Episode 4. Written and read by Arthur W. Johnson. I want this, thus it is mine, spoke the man who had no soul. It is mine because I say, spoke the man who was a fool. Across the southern wilderness of Canada, Bear Claw provided meat for Waving Grass and himself with his brown Bess. A cousin of Waving Grass had retrieved it the day they carried Bear Claw's near-lifeless hulk home to camp. While Bear Claw was healing, he had time to repair the damage that had caused it to jam when he had first tried to fire at the bear. Now, Bear Claw watched Waving Grass's belly grow thick as they trekked the forests of pine and spruce. They had lain each night under the stars and clouds, or under a hastily built lean-to which warded off little of the drenching rains. The mosquitoes buzzed by day and night, a constant hum, but Bear Claw had learned not to scratch and make the painful stings burn worse. As warmer nights began to wane, he decided it was time to turn south and settle in before the snows began to fly. There was still plenty of time, he thought, to get to a warmer climate before autumn ended. Waving Grass trudged along beside him as they passed through the trailless forest of unspeakable, beautiful green trees with trunks big enough to hide a man. When they saw the first signs of habitation in the form of paths, their journey became slow and cautious. Paths became more numerous and began to cross each other with more frequency. Dusk brought them to the edge of a vast body of water, and they were stunned by what they could see in the failing light. They stood close to each other as the wind whipped the surface into little waves. They chanced discovery as they camped at the water's edge and listened to the waves lapping at the rocky shore. Again they slept in an embrace after their urgent needs had been fulfilled. They had been destined for this life since their first touch by the marsh near her home village. By first light they were in awe of the magnitude of the sea whose lapping tide had sung their lullaby through the night. There was no land in sight save to right or left, and that was stone walls as far as one could see. They were at a low point in the land just above the water level. Bear Claw made a sharp stick and speared a lake trout the way Waving Grass's people had taught him. As the two halves of the fish smoked over a small fire, Waving Grass peeled off her doe-skin dress, the soft hide making a gentle sound of protest as it slipped up and off her body. The dried quills that adorned her neck harmonized and scraped together. She lapped the garment over her arm and loosened the ties that held her leggings, letting the garment slide down her slender legs. In all her glory, with garments over each arm and tassels gently swaying, she turned and stepped into the chilly water to scrub herself in her clothing. Bear Claw admired her from the shore as her long tresses fanned out around her face on the surface of the water. They seemed to form a raft, at the center of which rode the face he thought he had come to love, the face that spoke of all things gentle and kind, things he had never known before. She looked up from her scrubbing to see him staring and cocked her head as she smiled and said, "Why don't you come in?" She teased a bit as she rose waist-deep out of the water, and in mock bashfulness laid the dress over her shoulder to cover her bare breasts. He cupped his hands beneath his chest and replied, "I ain't got nothing to keep me afloat." And he caught the soggy dress when she playfully threw at his flashing eyes. As he hung it dripping over the bush near the fire, he heard a twig snap nearby and whirled to peer into the brush. With one hand he waved a warning to Waving Grass, who ducked beneath the surface and swam to the cover of an overhanging rock. A few moments in the cold water for a quick bath had been invigorating, but she had not planned on an indefinite stay. She began to shudder with chills as Bear Claw threaded out of view through the growth in search of the intruder. After a while he stopped and squatted down to listen for telltale sounds, but heard nothing. As he was about to turn back to camp, he spotted something in the dry leaves beneath the brush within arm's reach. He recognized it to be a toe, that of a right foot of a youth by the looks of it. He made as if he had not noticed and was about to leave, but as he leaned forward to rise, he lashed out at where the ankle should have been and snatched the foot from under its owner. The surprised young Indian crashed onto his back in the brush as Bear Claw leapt upon him and pulled the knife from the boy's hand. With his knee on the young man's chest, he examined the knife before shoving it in his own belt. With open hands, he gestured to the youth that he, too, was unarmed and would do him no harm. Bear Claw slowly raised his knee, and the young man backed away into a sitting position. Waving Grass had clambered out of the water, wrapped a blanket about herself, and sat shivering by the fire. She looked up as they approached, but remained huddled under the blanket. She listened as Bear Claw told how he had made the capture. She asked in her own tongue where the youth came from, but the boy stared in complete lack of understanding. Bear Claw tried hand signs and was surprised to see him reply that they lived all around him. He asked how many, and the youth answered that there were 5. "Small band," Bear Claw said in English. He signed, "Is that your whole band?" The boy signed back, "No, only my father's family, which is made up of my parents, an older sister, and an infant brother." "What are your people called?" Bear Claw signed. "Anishinabeg," spoke the youth with obvious pride. Waving Grass said to Bear Claw, "I know that name. It means first man. They think that all mankind came from their ancient fathers. I think they speak the Chippewa tongue." Bear Claw stared at the youth for a moment before grunting. He looked out across the vast waters and signed, "What are these waters called?" "Kichigama," the lad said. He seemed to think for a moment, then signed and spoke, "My people are also called the Kichigama-Wininawug." Bear Claw chuckled and said, "We'll stick with Anishinabeg. It's easier to say." The lad looked at him questioningly as he repeated the jest and sign. Bear Claw leaned forward, pulling his knife from his scabbard, and the lad leaped backwards in defense. Bear Claw looked up, startled by the sudden move, and paused before pulling half the fish from the fire. He cut it in half and offered it to the lad as he sat down cautiously. With his free hand he asked the lad what he was called. He replied, "Mishkwasi." He took a bite of the fish after his host and then signed, "What are you called?" He watched the mauled face as the answer came and asked if that was the cause of the marks. Waving Grass interrupted and signed, "He is a very brave man. He killed a bear with only a knife." Mishkwasi looked from one to the other with a new expression. He no longer saw Bear Claw as a captor and knew that his father would approve if he invited him to his mother's lodge. Waving Grass said to Bear Claw, "I will be glad for the warmth. I am so cold from the waters of the Kichigami." As Bear Claw led Mishkwasi down to the bank a short distance to give Waving Grass some privacy, a muskrat waddled lazily across the clearing. The lad pointed at it and whispered, "Mishkwasi." Bear Claw looked from Mishkwasi to Mishkwasi and chuckled. He patted the lad on the shoulder and said, "You are a muskrat, my young friend." Mishkwasi looked perplexed, for Bear Claw had spoken in English. Bear Claw ducked his head and blinked as he entered the lodge, trying to adjust to the dim light filtering through the smoke hole. The smell of freshly cut cedar boughs caressed his nostrils as the matting cushioned his step. The low walls of pine logs formed a square room 20 by 20 feet. The bark had been scraped from the inside face of the logs and saved for the winter fires. The roof poles were of birch trunks and the size of a man's thigh where they rested on the walls. Pine saplings were tied crosswise to the birch poles, then covered with the birch bark to repel rainwater and snow. Along the walls there were sleeping platforms 3 feet off the floor to be above the drafts. The space below the platforms was used for storing the sleeping mats and other goods, allowing the platforms to be used during the waking hours for sitting and other tasks. Mishkwasi's father sat on the platform making snowshoes for the winter when they entered, with ankles crossed, his legs dangling over the side as he bored a hole in the willow limb with a flint auger. He looked up and greeted them with a nod as he spoke to his son. Mishkwasi answered while gesturing at them. Setting aside his project, the father rose and faced the two, saying, "I am Mitig Wagok-wat. I speak some English. Undus, come, warm yourself by the fire." "Much obliged," Bear Claw said, indicating Waving Grass. "Her clothes are still a little wet, and I'm sure she's cold." He looked around and added, "Cozy lodge you have here. Looks like it would be warm in the winter." "It will be," came the woman's voice from the doorway. "My husband's name means tree axe, for he is the best builder in our village." "Mishuwinatig Ningoje," said Mitig to the woman. Then he said to Bear Claw, "I told her to go." "Wait," said Waving Grass. "May I speak with her? I have not spoken with another woman for a long time." Mitig looked at Waving Grass's belly for a moment before her reasons dawned on him. "Stay," he said to the woman. "I will walk with—" "Bear Claw," said Bear Claw. "Bear Claw in the forest for a while." As they were leaving, Bearclaw heard Mishawin Hautig say that her name meant apple tree, and the two women laughed at the irony of Triax marrying apple tree. Mitig's daughter, who was ready to become a wife soon, approached with an armload of firewood to be put away for the winter. As the three men were leaving the clearing, Bearclaw found it hard to hide his interest in the ripe young maiden as she passed with a nod. The following day found Waving Grass fevered and delirious with pneumonia. The extended stay in Kichigami had begun to take its toll. Apple Tree set about the task of mixing herbal concoctions and trying to control the fever. She sent the men away when Waving Grass began showing signs of unusual contractions. Therefore, only she and her daughter were present when Bearclaw's son was born without breath or heartbeat. It was too soon, Apple Tree explained later to Bearclaw. The baby was not yet whole. What do you mean, not whole? The fingers and toes were still like the frog, was her reply. Not like this, she said, showing her own baby's fingers. What about Waving Grass? Will she be all right? He asked. Your Siksika woman will be well in time. She still does not know day from dark. But I have made much of the herb medicine. See, I keep it in this mokuk, she said, touching the birch bark container, normally used for large quantities of maple syrup. She raised a portion on a spoon and said, I give her this much 4 times each day. Already she is better. Bearclaw grunted and left the lodge to wander in the woods. He discovered a creek hidden in the glen and sat by its edge to watch the bream swimming in the hollow and to think. Plenty of fish close by, tight shelter for the winter, a lot of firewood stored away already, moose and deer meat dried for long keeping. What more could a man want? A woman, of course, once she healed and got over her fever. Fever, of course, but she wouldn't remember much that occurred during her illness, and there was time, just enough, before her illness ended. So Apple Tree had said of his Siksika, his Blackfoot woman. She would not know what had caused her illness and fever or how contagious it was, and that would be to his advantage. After all, there were almost enough supplies for 2 people to last the winter, especially if one of them was ill and not eating. But 7 would require a lot more hunting and gathering. A lot more. He smiled to himself and leaned back against the sun-dappled birch and stared through the forest. There seemed to be an abundance of everything here, an abundance that he would be a fool to ignore. He didn't want to work at hunting and gathering for the winter. He didn't want to share the work or the benefits. He had shared enough as a child until it hurt, painfully. His parents had 14 children, and he had had his fill of sleeping at the foot of the bed and eating cold potatoes. He had been caught stealing food and hoarding it for himself. His father had beaten him severely with his bare fists and allowed him only a crust of bread while he watched the others eat his portion for several days. That was just one of the many punishments that he remembered, and none of them were justified in his book. After a week of that punishment, he had stolen the brown bess and left home at the ripe age of 14 and made his own way. Determined to be his own man, he had hunted and fished his way south before going north and west, occasionally selling pelts, but never staying in one place for very long. Now he had found a place to settle down for a while and would not share it with anyone except Waving Grass to keep him warm. He was relieved that the baby had not lived, for that would have been one more to share with, one more mouth to feed. As far as Mitig's family was concerned, he would have to get them out of his way. He would simply await his opportunity and kill them one by one. That didn't bother him, for he had already tasted blood, and once the bear tastes blood, it is no longer content with berries. He began to think of the possible ways to eliminate them when a pair of blue jays wheeled through the glen, screeching back and forth at each other, interrupting his thoughts. He saw a movement off in the near distance and rose to explore. He watched through a thicket as Wabi-Nebik, Mitig's daughter, picked berries and put them in a basket. She was alone, providing him with his first opportunity, one he dared not pass up. He would just have a little fun with her before. As they struggled for her virtue, they rolled over the basket, crushing the berry juice into Bearclaw's buckskin-covered hip. Her face showed revulsion for his maniacal features, enhanced by the scars. She called out for help during the struggle, but the lodge was too far away. He feared that someone would be close enough to hear, so he slugged her into silence. She lay unconscious on her back, moving only with his movements. It had begun. He would have what he wanted. He must ensure that, and did so with the edge of his knife across her silken throat. She would not speak of this incident to anyone. He dragged her lifeless form into the thicket and covered her over with the broken berry bushes. Then he made his way to the nearby creek to clean the blood from his hands. Inside the lodge, Bear Claw heard the moan of the still delirious waving grass. He entered and blinked to adjust his eyes to the fainter light. Apple Tree was administering more of the medicine from the mokook and wiped Waving Grass's forehead with a dampened piece of soft doeskin. She looked up and smiled as he approached. "She is getting better," she said. "Soon she will be kushkuz in awake." Good, good, he said. After a moment he asked, "Where are Mitig and Mishkwasi?" "They have gone to follow the moose. They will be back later when the sun rests." Bear Claw rubbed his hairy jaw where Wabi Nebik had scratched him in their struggle. He sat down on the platform and compared the unfinished snowshoe to the completed one and decided that he could finish the work. It would be a necessary item of winter wear. "Did you see Wabi Nebik in the forest?" asked Apple Tree. Keeping his eyes lowered to hide the lie, he said no. He said no more. He wanted to rest before he confronted her, knowing from her own lips that the time was growing short, but wanting to prove his manhood again before he killed her. "She was gathering berries," she said. "I know, you already said so." He was getting agitated with her talk. "And you did not see her?" "No." "What is this?" she asked, touching the stain on his hip. He had not noticed it before, therefore he had no planned answer. She saw his agitation and backed away. He charged her before she could reach the door and flung her sideways against the cradle board with her infant strapped in. He heard the startled baby begin to screech and then become silent as it was crushed under its mother's weight. Ignoring her safety, Apple Tree snatched up the baby but saw that it was too late. Still holding the baby in her left arm, she screamed in anguish and hurled herself at him, flailing with her right fist. He drew his knife and sheathed it in her charging body. She clawed at his chest as she slid to the cedar boughs on the floor, struggling no more. He moved her body and that of the baby out of sight, built up the fire so that it would look normal on the return of the hunters. They would become the hunted. He laid out a bow and a few flint-tipped arrows on the platform, then sat down beside them, leaning his back against the wall and pulling his knees up under his chin. He had been dozing with his forehead on his knees when he heard the pack dogs barking in the distance. He jumped off the platform and stoked the fire to give himself light and make it look right from outside. He took his place by the bow and waited, listening. He heard Mitig say something to his son, then the quick padding of feet running toward the door. Bear Claw notched an arrow, drew back the string, and waited. Misquashi dashed in, jabbering in Ojibwa, and saw Bear Claw just as the arrow pierced his heart. His eyes stared in disbelief as he stood suspended before crashing to the floor. Bear Claw raced over, peeked around the hide covering. Seeing Mitig busy with the carcass of the moose, he judged that he had time to move Mishkwasi aside to better surprise Mitig. He looked out the door afterward in time to see Mitig turn and call again for his son. "Michelinatig," he said to the silent door. "Wabi Nebik," he called in a concerned voice. Bear Claw took up his position again as Mitig came through the door. The arrow thunked into the hide as the door was thrown back. Mitig looked around it as Bear Claw notched another arrow. Mitig took a quick look at his son's body and charged at Bear Claw with the fury of a wounded moose. The bow cracked under their weight and the arrow flipped end over end, landing fletches first in the boughs on the floor. The two men, equal in size and strength, rolled and grappled, fell off the platform with a crash and separated. Mitig lunged again, and Bear Claw lashed out with his feet, kicking Mitig over backwards onto the floor. Bear Claw leapt to his feet and started to pounce on Mitig when he saw the shock in Mitig's eyes and the glistening point of the flint protruding from the man's belly, red with blood. Mitig stood over him and heard him ask in a raspy voice, "Why?" "I don't like to share," Bear Claw said with a shrug. Mitig's eyes closed forever. After the sun rose, Bear Claw set about the task of burying the bodies, including the one in the berry thicket. He fabricated a story for everyone asking about them. He would simply tell them about the fever that had struck the encampment and show them the graves as proof. He then settled it down to the job of nursing Waving Grass back to health. After all, a man needed someone to cook for him and keep him warm in the winter. He had what he wanted for the moment, a well-provisioned home for the winter, water nearby, and a woman, when she was well again. He would become wealthy with a few beaver traps along creeks and lakes shore through the winter months. He laid his plans for the fur trade as the first snows covered the graves.
Music by Kevin MacLeod.
You're listening to Big World Network.